Hey everyone, welcome to the video. I'm pretty excited for this one. It may seem like kind of a boring topic, but I have actually really enjoyed a lot of the work that went into prepping for this. Yeah, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a new topic. Lately, I haven't been doing a ton of like cool front end React app development. I've kind of just been using Docker tutorials to teach myself about DevOps lately. Um, what I have actually done and prepared for today is combined a couple of my past projects that I already have videos for, and then deployed those with some considerable improvements, but the deployment using Docker Compose. So I'm going to show you guys how pretty much I set up all of the DevOps parts using Docker and what a Docker Compose looks like. We'll probably look at some Docker files as well, which is how you build your own Docker containers or images, rather. And we're also going to go through all of the changes to the configuration of the apps themselves. So there's a whole nother backend node.js application running now with in tandem with my React apps. So we'll talk about that. But everything on the front end is going to look very similar to what we've seen in my past two videos, which this is going to be a combination of my last video, the simple login user handling app, and the video before that, which was just displaying NBA players and then grouping them by teams. Yeah, mash those two together and it's all deployed in one Docker Compose. I'll show you guys how that works. Um, and yeah, we are running Linux here, as you could see. I had a lot of trouble kind of dealing with Docker's version of for Windows. So I ended up just downloading a virtual machine and setting one up. So we're doing all of this on Linux now. Kind of funny how their stock backgrounds are all so interesting, but that's what we got there. And yeah, so here's the app. A lot like everything that I've showed in the past. Like we've all seen this with with the NBA players and everything. And then up here we also have our user component, so we know which users signed in and everything. The difference here is that all of this data that we're seeing here is coming from an API now, and all of the data that we would be seeing if we were logged in or not, well, this is all of the data that is being fed to the user component is also coming from an API now. So I built this API using just a node.js backend, and I used Express.js to build that. So we'll look at some code for that later, but let's actually just look at our network tab, and we'll do a refresh here. Hopefully we're not too slow today. I tried to change some of my OBS settings so that we could record and still be pretty quick here. So here are two network calls here, to the user's endpoint and to the player's endpoint. And we could see, okay, I'm gonna be in the way. I'm just gonna move myself up here. One sec, cool. We could see that we're making this call to localhost 3001. We're running this front end on localhost 3000. But we made the call to 3001 to our API users endpoint, and here is what our response looks like. So there are users, there's like 6 of them in there right now, and Same deal here for our players. The payload's really large for players. There's like 500 of them, so the response will take a little while to load up. But yeah, there's all of our players. And we can even, yep, so RJ Barrett, there we go, his team. All the same data that was previously stored in a JSON folder, just in our repository, which it still is. It's still there now, but we're accessing it through an actual API that was built in the back end, which is great. So we can see that API here. Now, if we just pull up the localhost 3000, we can actually get all of our, records from our API, which is a big improvement. So just a lot more of a legit feel here, where even for the users, we're not doing anything with that JSON server package that I was doing before, which is kind of like a fake testing API, if you remember from that video. So this is all coming from an Express.js API that I actually built. So we can show that, we'll do something with the login feature real quick, just to show that that's actually making API calls. So let's log in as Pope. And we'll see, we get a put request to users. And now we're logged in as Pope over here. And if we go to our user's endpoint and refresh, we will see, yeah, we're logged in right there. Cool. So now let's look at the code for that really quick. So that's pretty much what's new. Everything else is going to work the same as it has in past videos. You have your account tab where you can, use, those features that I went over in that video. So yeah, let's look at the node.js API, and we're also going to go over how the API is communicating with a database. So that's the other new thing that's introduced here, is that instead of storing all of our data just in a JSON file in the repository, it's stored in a real database that is deployed with a Docker container. So Docker has an image called Mongodb. I think Mongo is like some kind of database company, but there's a Docker image for it where you can just start up your own database and connect to it and start using it. So that's where all of this data that you are seeing is actually coming from. I've stored it in the Mongo database, and that is running with a Docker container. Hopefully that will all make sense by the end of this video, but I guess we'll see how I do. So the first thing that we're going to look at is just the Node.js backend. And I completely kind of gutted my repo here, so now I have this is the Docker Compose file. This is how you run the whole app. We'll get into that at the end, kind of, but there's a package JSON for the whole app, and then I have my front end and my back end, and those are like separate code bases that do their own things, and those build out into their own images with their own separate Docker files. So we're going to start with the backend, which is really just this server.js. This thing uses Express.js. And that's how you build an API endpoint. So what we're doing with Express is we are saying down here, one second, okay. I was looking for some text, but everything is defined up here so that it can be changed easily. So we're saying build this endpoint right here using Express. So if we look for this user endpoint or player endpoint, you'll see that everything is separate for these. We can go down to where we're instantiating that. So here's where we set up, for instance, the GET request for the player endpoint. So app.get is how you initialize, I guess, a new endpoint with Express.js. And we're saying if there's a GET request, then send the request's body. And then what I want you to do is connect to the Mongo database, which MongoDB is our container that we're expecting to be running while we're using this node.js. So this all had to be developed kind of with that being tested. So I would have the MongoDB running and then try to connect to it, and it's just kind of trial and error. Okay, how do I get these things to talk to each other? So I use this Mongo client and connect, and here is more of our static stuff. We'll talk about this environment variable later on as well, but yeah. So this is how you configure all the requests. And the final thing that we're doing is our actual method, which is get users. And the methods are all up here. These do all of the different things that I want to do when communicating with the database, essentially. So get users is right here. That's probably the one that we use the most, because every time you reload the page, you have to get the users so that we can properly display the user component so that we see which user is logged in or not. And yeah, these are all from their Mongo commands. So the user database is what we named kind of the database inside of Mongo. I'll show you guys that. And the table, same deal, named it users. And find is the actual Mongo method. Or maybe function. Still a little shaky on that. But find is going to do just get all of the records in this table pretty much. So that's what we're doing when we do get users, and get players, same deal, we're using find. For another thing like log out, we use update one, because log out is just a put request, I believe, where all we're doing is changing that logged in from true to false. So yeah, once again, this is just unique to MongoDB. So that's how you communicate with that software. And then insert one is another one, delete one, that's for delete users, signups, insert one, change password, update one. Same deal as log out and log in. They're all update, because those are put requests. So each of those requests is configured like this. There's a get player and get user. I was hoping to be able to combine these, but it was a little bit of a weird thing. Didn't end up doing that. That's more for the next steps section. And then the put request for populating players is here. And then all of the put requests for users is here, which is log out, log in, change, and populate. Those are all put requests. Then our post would be sign up. So you have to configure all of your request types separately with Express.js. At least that's how I was able to get this thing to work. So I'm not sure if this is even the best way to do this, but yeah, this was my first time ever setting up a backend or an API of any kind. So I thought this went fairly well. These did take a good while to get them to all work out. So what does this change with what we're actually doing? So it means that every time we are doing a request from the front end, we do that with Axios, but it's running this put method. And I think get is actually a better example. So every time you're doing a get request, it runs this method and connects to the Mongo client, which is saying, okay, is there a MongoDB here for me to look at? And then if it finds one, it does the get users using this method, which says, okay, look at this database, look at this table, find all the records. So that's how that actually works, and here we'll show how that's done on the front end, since that actually changed a little bit as well. So we will just look at the user component. The user component on its did mount is going to just use this get service and get all of the users. So let's check out that service actually, because that's more important for what we're doing here. The get service is just an Axios request. Actually, no, it's just a fetch request. So I used some regular fetch, and I also used Axios in some of the front end components. So we'll check that out as well. So we're just doing a fetch to the local host, and here's our server port, which is in our env file, but that's set to 3001 right now, and then our endpoint, which that's passed in here. So as we saw, let's double click that in our user component, we have to specify the endpoint because we have the users and the players endpoint. So we want to get the users in this case, and they all come from that fetch request. So the flow here is you refresh the page and the component mounts. So then this get service runs. And the get service says, look at the localhost 3001 at this endpoint, users in this case. What does it say? And at the same time, localhost 3001 is saying, okay, someone's trying to access us, so run this get users, which looks at the MongoDB. This database and this table gets all of the users. So now kind of the final piece of the puzzle is, all right, where is Mongo? How does Mongo have our data? So that is all set up in the Docker. So starting up a Docker container is done just by running, well, it's done a ton of different ways. You could just do it in your terminal, but I wanted to run 4 containers at the same time for this app. So I did it all with this Docker Compose file, and here is how you configure each service in a Docker Compose. So Essentially, if you have no experience with Docker, this doesn't matter at all, um, because the only way you'll understand this is just by doing a tutorial, and I'm going to link to an excellent one in the description of this where I learned pretty much everything that went into this project. But here are 4 services here: MongoDB, Mongo Express, Finite FE, and Finite BE, and Finite FE. So we'll talk about what all those are, but the MongoDB is initialized right here so that when you run this file, it knows to start up this image and give it this configuration. And then Mongo Express, this is just a GUI for MongoDB. So MongoDB is the actual database, and Mongo Express is an interface that allows you to kind of interact with it behind the scenes. And gave it the same admin and password, username and password, and we say that it's MongoDB server in the environment section here is MongoDB because that's what we named our Mongo service. Okay, so that's how these two are talking to each other. So we'll be able to use our Mongo Express GUI to actually look at our database. So that's what I'm going to show you now. And here we see that it's on port 8080. So let's check that out. And here's your Mongo Express. So this shows all of the data that our API is looking at when it gets a request, any request, get, put, post, delete, whatever it may be. Here's our player account database, and then collections are kind of like tables. So our players table here, this was all configured in the back end there. We told the back end where to look in the MongoDB. So yeah, this is just a graphic representation of our database. This is what the API will see when it goes to look for this stuff. And each record looks something like this, just like what we see on our back end here. I mean, on our, I guess our API endpoint here. So this is what's being queried pretty much. We have an actual database which our API is looking at to say, okay, use this information. That should be good there. So that's those 2 containers. Now, we're going to talk about these 2 containers, which are different and similar in plenty of ways. I'll try to make this somewhat coherent, but this is not the easiest thing for me to explain. It's very new to me as well, so hopefully you guys are in the same boat. But what we have here is our finite backend and our finite front end images. So we're going to start up a container with this image, and the image is listed right here. Now this is an AWS registry, and this is my AWS ID. So what I did is actually built these containers for the back end and the front end of this application. And I'll try to explain to you guys why I did that, but the differences here are that MongoDB, for instance, this is an official Docker image. So this image, when we run this Docker compose, which I'll show you guys how that all works, but when we run this compose file, Docker is going to pull this MongoDB image, and all it has to know is that it's pulling Mongo because it has an official image in its registry. When it gets to this one and says, okay, I have to pull this finite backend image, I don't know what that is, but it looks like we have an address to an AWS registry right here. So that's how Docker will know, okay, I have to go to this remote registry, not my registry. Docker can just like use its own shortcut when it has Mongo in its own Docker Hub registry, but this I personally built and pushed to my own AWS account, just right here, and put it on this ECR registry. I hope that makes a little bit of sense, but like I said, I'm going to link to very good videos that taught me about this stuff. So, finite backend. This guy is built from a node.js image, and what this one does is pretty much just starts up server.js, this file. When you start this thing up locally, it'll just say listening on port 3000, and then you can go and kind of interact with it here, like we've been doing. But in order for me to kind of get this whole app to deploy together, I had to have an actual container I had to start up an actual Node.js container that would run the server.js file for me. So here is essentially what is happening there. Building a Docker image is just done with a Docker file where you say which image we're starting with, which I just started with a regular node. Probably should have done the Alpine version since they're lighter weight, but I didn't know that at this point. And then this command these are all Linux commands, so this is just making a new folder inside of the container. This is not on my machine anymore. This is going to be happening inside of the container, which has its own kernel. It's pretty much, yeah, that's the best I'm going to be able to do to explain that right now, actually. So then it copies my entire source folder and adds it to the app folder that we just created inside the container. And then we're going to start working out of app. That's what work directory does. And all it's going to do is run yarn, just download our dependencies for Node.js pretty much. I'm not even sure if this is necessary, but I have that in there. And then the command is what runs last right before we start up the container. So the image does all of this every time you start up a container for this. And starting up a container is done when you run a Docker Compose file like this. So the last thing that it's going to do is just run yarn start, and that is what is going to pretty much execute our nodemon server.js. So this runs our server, and that's how all of the stuff that's happening with this server.js file is tied together into an image that I pushed to my AWS repository and can then start up a container of using Docker Compose here. Same thing for the front end, but different. We're not using, because I had to make an image this time that would run a React app. So there's a lot of ways to do that, and I did it this way to optimize for a few things. So we'll see again that or getting this from my registry or from the AWS ECR registry on my user. And then what we're doing is setting up a volume. So I'm going to try to explain how this image is different from the node.js image. In our Docker file for the front end component, we're taking this from Nginx, and I did the Alpine this time because that's the latest way. But Nginx pretty much allows you to display any JavaScript, just front end that you want. And all I had to do to change the container to make it work for, or change the image rather, to make it work for a React app was remove the regular config file and add my own config file. So I did that. Here, where am I? Oh yeah. So here's my new config file. I had to kind of just struggle through this and figure out what Nginx needed in order to be able to run a React app, and that can all be seen kind of just in my GitHub because I don't fully know what was going on with that, in all honesty, but it needed to be reconfigured, so I made my own config file and added that in. So that's my Nginx image. It doesn't actually have any of my code in it because what we're doing is starting up this container and then pointing it at my code using this volume. So the difference here is this finite backend. By the way, I'm sure you're wondering like why this says finite. I just named the app Finite because the app doesn't really do anything yet, and I just think Finite is a cool name for it. So I didn't know what to name it yet. I just thought Finite was a cool name for an app. So that's what our back end and front end images come from. But yeah, our Finite backend image, that is pretty much all this does is run one server.js file. And anytime that I wanted to change that server.js file, I would have to make the change here and then rebuild the Docker image using the Docker file and then push that back to the ECR registry. So you see that this is tagged version 1.4 because I've changed it a ton of times. I think I went through a bunch of them and kind of went back to 1.0 like a week ago too, and now I'm up to 1.4 again because anytime I make a change to this image or just the server.js file, pretty much I have to rebuild the image and push it back to the repository. Our front end, not the case, because all I did was take the Nginx image and do that reconfiguration so that it would cooperate with what I was trying to do with it with React, and then push that to my my registry here. And now the way this image works is anytime you start up a container of it, you just give it a volume and point it at the repo where you want it to load its code into the Nginx HTML folder. So what this is actually doing is it's saying, okay, take this code from here and then inside the container add all of this code to the Nginx HTML folder. And then Nginx takes it from there and um, and starts up your front end. So that was why I chose Nginx and why this was just really helpful for being able to deploy um, the app as a whole with front end, back end, and database. That's why these could all go together here, because they're all doing separate things, but the containers are all run at the same time using Docker Compose. So what our front end build folder is here is right here. This is just an optimized build that comes with React scripts. So anytime you run React scripts build, it creates this build folder inside your root for you. So all of my development still goes down in source here. This is where all my components are, but here's my package JSON for the front end, when I run build, it will say React scripts build, which then guts this folder and builds a new optimized build and adds it back to the build folder. So that is what Nginx is actually running off of. And the only thing that this finite front end image does is say, okay, start up Nginx with this new configuration, and then look at this folder and display it. So that's what I like a lot about this this Nginx image, is that I don't have to rebuild the image all the time when I'm making changes. All I have to do if I want to run the actual Docker image is make my changes just right here and then run yarn build, and then restart the Docker image, and it'll have my changes in there. So that's kind of how the Docker Compose works, and I think that was kind of all I wanted to get through before demonstration of that. Yeah. So here is what is running right now. These are all of our containers running together, but I'm going to just stop this, and we'll see that it stops all of my containers. And then we'll just check over here. We're going to see that this stuff all doesn't work anymore. See? None of this is going to show up now. So now here's what an actual deployment looks like using Docker Compose. We're just going to, using the package JSON in our top root, we're just going to run yarn prod, which does Docker Compose with the force flag and finite, and then runs finite.yaml up. So finite.yaml is the Docker Compose file that we were looking at. I made a bunch of other ones for if I wanted to like only run the front end or only run the database, only run the back end, but this is going to be the actual prod one. So yeah, let's just see what happens when we start that up. You see that it runs the finite YAML, starts my my 4 containers, and then we see that all of their logs are combined here. So each of those colors is one of the containers, which is a separate operating system with its own kernel, just doing stuff, and these are all talking to each other. So here's our finite backend. We'll see that it's running. Oh yeah. Let's go up a little. Yeah, finite backend. So yarn run was the second to last part of our Docker file, and then the last part of our Docker file was yarn start, which actually maps to node.mon server.js. So that's that being run, and then this is what happens when that gets run. We see that it starts node server, and then down here we see that I have two console logs here. We'll talk about that with the env file, but and then it says listening on port 3000. So that's our backend, and Mongo Express is in blue here. The MongoDB is in green here. Those two I mostly just used for debugging when stuff doesn't work. Kind of go and look in those logs and see, okay, what's wrong here. But I think right now everything should be good. And our front end is right here as well, which will just say ready to start up, and it'll tell you when we get requests. We'll see the front end pop up as well. So down here, yeah, it looks like everything is good. And now let's go back to the app and see if we are all good now. And we get our requests through. And everything shows up. And we should, yeah, be working all completely fine. We get everything to load up. Nice, right? Cool, so I also want to show that you can also use the Mongo Express. Mongo Express isn't necessary for running this app. You could run it without that service, and everything will work fine. But it's really good for testing and making sure that everything works the way that you want. So, like this, if I wanted to just use this button to delete all my records, I could, and that would then test out. See, it got rid of the whole database there. And that would then test out what would happen in the app if my database wasn't there for some reason. So we'll check that out. And oh, actually, I don't know what's going to happen at this route. But we don't want to be there because there's no data. So let's just go back to the regular. Cool, we'll go to app. And it's going to say no players in the database. Click here to add some for testing. So rather than having it just have nothing there if there's no players, like that's not very useful. So I put this button in which will send a put request putting all of our players back in there, which is why I actually still have this, this scrape repo with like all of our players' stats in here. I've still got all this data saved in the repository. Oh wait, that's the Python. Yeah. Like here, I've still got all this data saved in the repository, but this is how I can put it into the database. So I do this, we get a put request through, and then our data shows up. And we'll see what that looks like in the logs. Oh yeah, I probably should do that. You see, every time we reload the page, we see that from the back end, we're getting a GET request in our logs. And for example, here's when we added all of our players. We're getting this, you scroll all the way up here. Our put request, or the function is populate, tells us the database and the players, or the table, so we had to specify that. And then it's taking all of this from stats and sending it to the MongoDB. You see it says 410 more because it doesn't log all of them when you try to send 510 at the same time. So that's what's happening there. It's we could do the same thing, or I have the same button show up if there's nothing in the user table as well. And the last thing that so yeah, that's how you could just check out all the logs there. And that's what's actually happening between all of your containers when you run a Docker Compose. So the last thing that I want to talk about is actually to jump back to the server.js, because this is going to present kind of a good thing about my back-end image, and then a bad thing about my front end, or a kind of a challenge with the front end image. So what I have here is my host is configured to be either this variable or this variable. These are both stored in my env file, so I'll show you that. But I'm saying if this mode env variable is equal to dev, then I want it to be the host dev, but if not, I want it to be the host prod. And then our Mongo URL is how we connect to the MongoDB. So this is used down here in all of our put and get requests. You see, it's popping up right there. But the difference between these two is this. You see, our mode variable is set to dev, because if we're debugging, if we're just running this with on our local machine, then it'll read this, but which means that the host will be set to localhost, and that means that the Mongo URL will be set to localhost 27017. But if we were to configure the environmental variable of mode to be not dev, then it would set it as host prod, which would then set the host to MongoDB, and we would have a different string there when we're connecting to the Mongo client. So this was big because if you're on your local machine, then and you're just testing this out, you want to be using localhost. But if you're running the actual container, that's in a different operating system, so it can't see your localhost. It has to use Mongo's just generic host string, which is MongoDB, and I was able to set that in the environment variables. I was able to say mode equals prod, and now when the container is actually pulled up, it'll be in prod mode, and it'll set that host to MongoDB instead of localhost. So that changes based on the environment that you're running the app on, which was huge for being able to do this. Now, you can see here that I also tried to set up an environment variable for the front end, where if you know about React apps, you have to set all of your env variables to start with React app. And I wanted to set the server port so that I could change this port and then just change the port right here as well, and they would still be able to communicate. This doesn't actually do anything right now. This thing doesn't work because Nginx displays the front end using that build folder that we talked about before. So that is the challenge here, that I am not building this folder when I start up the container. And in the future, if I wanted to be able to configure the port that the server is running on, I would actually have to completely change the container to, like the back end one, have all of my code in it rather than just pointing at it and running a volume. So that was kind of a challenge that I went through, but the solution is really just to not rely on this and just to have in my source code, pretty much everything is, yeah, hard coded. It still has an env file, but everything is just hard coded to use 3001. So if I wanted to run the back end from a different port, I would just have to make sure that I went into my front end env file and changed this to the right port first, and then did a build and deployed that way. So that's pretty much all of the changes that I've had and been able to kind of run this app now. And I think all of you should be able to run this app as well if you wanted to. You could go to this finite repo on my GitHub and just clone this thing. And that is exactly what I did in preparation of this video. So when I set up, when I wrote all of the code for all of that Docker and some of the backend stuff, I did that on like the first VM that I ever set up on this computer. And then yesterday, in preparation of this video, I created a completely new VM, so totally fresh operating system and everything after I had pushed this to GitHub. And all I did was download VS Code and connect it to Git and pull down this repo. And then what I had to do, it's all in the README here. This is how you guys can get this thing up and running on your machine using Docker. Then all I had to do from a completely fresh repo that I had never, set up to any of my preferences, all I had to do was first install a Docker engine and Docker Compose, and then also install the AWS CLI so that I could log in to AWS to be able to pull images from AWS's registry. So you need those three installed so that you can use the images. And then I also, for the front end container, had to run yarn build. So that builds my front end. I just kept the optimized build folder in the git ignore, so that's not on GitHub. So all I had to do was run yarn builds to create that build folder so that the front end image would have something to point to. And the final thing was download this CORS blocker. Not really sure what's going on here. I use this at work as well, but my API requests would all be blocked if I didn't do this. So since it's a brand new operating system, I didn't have this extension added. So I just added that and enabled it. It's right here. It looks like a little bug with a C. Yeah, I use this when testing locally at work as well because for some reason, I use it on Chrome too. My requests get blocked by some kind of course. I'm not even sure what course it is, but I'm sure I'll learn about that at some point. Hopefully never actually, but we'll see if I ever have to know what that actually is. And then yarn prod should start up the app exactly the way that I showed in this video. I know this is kind of like me just talking to the computer for an hour, but all of this explaining that I had to think through all culminated to being able to have this app pretty much where anybody can pull it down from GitHub and start it up and it will work exactly the way that I just demoed it. And that's all just using Docker because Docker sets up these containers that are their own little operating systems that can run your apps concurrently, or run your code bases concurrently, so that everything communicates well. Um, and uh, this stuff is hard to explain. I'm sorry if this is kind of just verbal vomit or anything, but really, this is my first step in all things DevOps, and it's been super interesting in all honesty. I'm definitely ready to get back into like doing cool things with React, but learning how to deploy this stuff was very valuable in my opinion. Um, and yeah, I also have some next steps that I think would be good moving forward. Obviously, getting a version of my Nginx image where I could use environmental variables would definitely be a good next step in continuation of like everything that of my DevOps education here. But beyond that, I think now that I have all of this operational, I'm ready to make the app actually do something. So I'm sure you guys are getting bored of just looking at the same thing over and over again, and the same ugly React app. I'm actually gonna say that the the next time I show you this app, it will not just be the stock React with Bootstrap. I'll make it look a little different, hopefully way better. Um, but I wanted to actually do something too. That's the biggest next step for me. Um, Another next step would be to have it not have to have all of that uh, those two huge JSON files stored in the repository for when I want to populate the database. I think should be able to like create some kind of RSS feed where um, I run those Python scripts using the feed, and I don't have to have the output of the Python scripts stored in a JSON folder or in a JSON file in my repository, because that's just stupid, and I don't want to have those there. So that's a good next step as well. Like on that side, not as crucial because honestly, this isn't going to anyone. Like no, I'm not going to be selling this to anybody. So I really just like I want to start working with React, trying to do cool stuff with the data that I have, and not worrying about, okay, is this data the most up to date? Is it like this is still the data from whatever 4 months ago when I made that NBA React first video. So obviously, like all of the players have probably, these aren't the same players that are in the NBA anymore. Um, Players change all the time. They get dropped, they quit, they new ones get drafted. This is everything in here is probably completely different right now. Plus, all the stats change. So I would want, if I'm actually doing something with NBA data, I'd want the data to be current in some way. So that would be a good next step as well. But first and foremost, I want to just get this thing to do something cool. And what that should be, I don't know. I have a ton of information about a ton of players and what teams they're on. So the sky is really the limit there. And I think once I've got something that's like, all right, this is not just a dumb website, then I can go and be like, all right, how do I optimize this data and make sure it's all current, and find out what an RSS feed even is first, probably, so before talking about it would be a good call. So I think those are all like separate rabbit holes that I've just got to dive down to start making this thing cool. But this whole video is really just wrapping up how everything is going to be deployed, and getting that strong base so that now when I do make something cool, I know that it's going to be available to people. So I hope this was helpful for you guys if anyone's struggling to kind of package together a bunch of different technologies that they want to run for a single app on their end. Yeah, so I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I definitely went way too long as usual, but these are, yeah. Please let me know what you guys think of this explanation. Give me a comment if any of this was helpful, if you're going to use the repo at all. If you do check it out, leave something. And thanks everyone for watching. I hope everybody has an excellent holiday season. You know, hopefully I get around to posting this before the end of that. But yeah, new videos coming soon. Super excited about this one, though, guys. Stay posted for updates. Thanks again. Cheers.